Crioso, and welcome back to Ancient Wales, Episode 4, Warriors and Warfare in Iron Age Britain. The Iron Age in Britain, as we've said previously, roughly spanned from 800 BCE to 43 CE, and it was a time of profound social and cultural change. The advent of ironworking transformed societies, enabling them to produce stronger tools and weapons. This innovation coincided with the rise of tribal kingdoms and the increasingly complex social structures that defined Britain at the time. Dr. Barry Cunliffe, a prominent archaeologist specializing in Iron Age Britain, noted, quote, "The period was marked by regional diversity, but also shared cultural practices, particularly in terms of material culture, fortifications, and warfare. Particularly the culture and material exchange, which went from Switzerland all the way to the farthest parts of Ireland. There was a patchwork of traders, invaders, and mystical leaders who were leading the charge. Trade and interaction with continental Europe had shaped Britain since the Bronze Age. Goods such as wine, pottery, and metals flowed through the trade network, bringing with them new ideas and technologies. These exchanges likely influenced both material culture and languages in the British tribes." Dr. Miranda Aldhouse Green highlights, quote, "The cross-channel trade not only brought goods, but also facilitated the exchange of stories, myths, and cultural practices, enriching the oral traditions of Britain. In Britain of that period, both of the early and mid-Iron Age, there was a patchwork of various types of groups. Some may have been tribes, others kingdoms, and others looking similar to what we would describe as city-states in their formation. Certainly, people like Julius Caesar saw Britain as a mishmash of various types of people, even if he put them into what we would consider a very racist, barbarian box, each with their own identity and territorial claims. These groups often engaged in warfare, not only for land, but also in resources, prestige, and control over trade routes. In other words, they were very human, like everybody else. So, what might be the cause of this increasing militant atmosphere in Britain? One that we have noted didn't exist as fully in the Bronze Age. Well, one explanation was the increasing colder temperatures, which were driving at least some from northern Britain south, and some from the coastal areas of Wales inland. These are small shifts, however. We're not talking about massive population shifting in the way we would see in later European stages, but rather they were minor in effect. Yet within that, we also have to keep in mind that the population of Iron Age Britain had exploded. It was now ranging over 1 million people. This would have been a substantial increase over the previous periods, and it would also have stressed the landscape as territory would now be needed and taken. In order to grow as much food as you need, you may need more land as you grow in population. Thus, the demand for capturing more land, more resources, more animals suddenly becomes part of the legacy of this era. This population growth was partly made possible by the introduction of new crops, including improved varieties of barley and wheat, and an increase in farming of peas, beans, flax, and other crops. Iron tools made it easier to grow crops through their efficiency and durability. At the same time, at the turn of the 800s BCE, there was a general increase in bronze tools and weapons being placed in different locations. In some cases, they were buried in the ground with their people who had carried them, we believe. In others, they were then thrown into rivers and lakes, such as large deposits that were found in Llyn Fawr in Wales. A number of archaeologists have posited ideas around this complicated economic scarcity and what was driving this need to get rid of bronze tools. Now, in some cases, it could be religious. In another, it may be, as I said, economic. How do you appease the gods, if we were to go with a religious basis, who seem to be causing such rapid change in the lives of people, early death, starvation, and warfare influencing so much of the population? Can you appease the gods by giving back that which you took from the earth? That's the logic of the argument. This is, of course, at best, educated guesswork based on other locations, written documents, and other ways of measuring anthropological discoveries and cultures we've witnessed over the years. But it does, at the end of the day, fit and make some sense to what we're seeing. It makes zero sense to deposit so many swords and spear points into water sources unless there's some overriding reason. Certainly, it makes far more sense than some capitalistic reason of driving the bronze economy, so to speak, which makes very little sense, I would argue, unless you were a Bronze Age blacksmith trying to, wring out a few more cows out of people for their swords or whatever it is you're trading for. All of these things have to be measured against that kind of argument. And that's why I think it makes it very elusive to be able to identify what's going on. Iron Age Britain has been an elusive teller of tales simply because we have to rely on records that are purely material in evidence rather than written documents, which we quite frequently, when looking at later ages, we rely in concert to what's going on. If you have a historical document that describes why something occurred, and then you have an archaeological site which then backs up that it occurred, it helps. It makes things easier to define and to grow into proper explanations. That's something we don't have in Britain at this time period, and so it's very difficult to gain a lot of knowledge. While we understand the day-to-day of people, it's a lot harder to take that day-to-day and measure it out into here's what's really happening. Like, for example, major war sites that we would think of don't necessarily pop up out of nowhere because quite frequently we have to have a lot of evidence of what's going on. And it's almost a miracle when we find sites from ages where there aren't written documentation that have these battles that have gone on and that they're easily told about or understood. So this is something we have to keep in mind when we're talking about this. And as we talk about this, we have to look at things like how were wars fought in Britain and what kind of developments were happening because of scarcity and growing populations bumping up against each other. How did this affect the day-to-day activities and the longer range activities of these various groups that we then meet when Julius Caesar arrives and later when Claudius and the rest of the Romans arrive? What drives what we define ancient Britain at that point? Who are the real tribes of Britain becomes one of the questions. And that we don't have solid answers to, but what we do have is material culture we can point to and say, with some sense of educated guesses, this is what we believe is going on. So, with all that in mind, let's look at how warfare generally was done in Britain. Initially, weapons were used in the Neolithic periods to fight in different ways, probably extenuating from hunting and going into battles against other groups over resources like cattle, sheep, and possibly just territory. In this period, it was largely bow and arrow, likely with flint-headed arrows, and versions of stone axes that were used in these fighting. Bodies were found at Bellisnap, Longbarrow in Gloucestershire, and Wayland's Smithy in Oxfordshire, as well as other locations in which the bodies were found to have killing blows done by axes or wounds done by arrows, showing that there had been hostile intent in what was going on. Hundreds of flint arrow heads have been found at causeways enclosures in Crickley Hill, Gloucestershire, and Hambledon Hill, Dorset, where attackers also burned the defensive palisades. So warfare was something that was fairly common, and innovation likely forced further developments and strategies. However, that was in the Neolithic period. Bows certainly were used in conflict as well as for hunting. Examples such as the Stonehenge archer was identified as a bowman because of his protective wrist guards and was shot in the back by 3 arrows and finished off at close range by another one. Though probably not the victim of violence, roughly contemporary, around 2300 BCE, the Amblesbury archer was also buried with wrist guards and a fine grouping of flint arrowheads. Probably arrows, but they decompose over time, so all that's left is the arrowheads and his other grave goods. However, signs of new metalworking technology would change that and would change warfare forever. In Britain, we find that some Bronze Age implements that were used in warfare did not exist, or weren't found, at least as far as we've been able to discover. Things like helmets, chest armor, and greaves, which are forearm and wrist protectors in bronze, did not exist in Britain. However, swords, daggers, arrowheads, and spears were now in bronze. The pointed ends of warfare were all about the new technology, even if the protection was not. In the Bronze Age, as weapons grew in use, there were some degree of territorial specialization, with swords used in the north, sword and spears in the southeast, and mainly spears in the southwest and Midlands of Britain. This may have been for a multitude of reasons, but that drove innovation around how these weapons were used and what would be used in the Iron Age. As pointed out a few episodes ago, the Bronze Age was perceived to be a mostly relatively peaceful period, and therefore it has been suggested that most weapons were about display and decoration and eventually ritual rather than war. Why do archaeologists think that way? Well, the reason is that conflict, although probably socially significant, may have been performative rather than destructive on a very local scale. This is because there was little evidence to associate infrastructure of warfare, such as Bronze Age grave sites that do not feature violent deaths, or the lacking of border markings and ditches being dug as defensive features, which also appear to be few and far between, unlike the Bronze Age, when they become much more frequently used and become, as you might say in modern parlance, a feature and not a bug. Once we are in the Iron Age, we see the intensification, however, of conflict, warfare, and burials that feature people who died by violence. The Iron Age traditionally is seen as an age of warfare, though even saying that, there is evidence of people who were killed or died through means that had nothing to do with warfare. So it's not like this was an immediate, everybody died by fighting. It was a case that there was a larger percentage that died through fighting, not necessarily everybody, and certainly more than in the last 1,000 years prior. For example, we see the emergence of what are called warrior burials, which over 100 have been identified. Interestingly, approximately half of these come from a single part of Britain in East Yorkshire. One would imagine that there would have been battles elsewhere, but this is a site where, at least it looks like, major conflict took place. Weapons recovered from burial sites and hoards, such as swords, spears, and shields, reveal the craftsmanship and technological sophistication of Iron Age warriors. These items were often decorated, suggesting that they held symbolic as well as practical value. Tacitus, the Roman historian, writing in the 1st century CE, provides a vivid picture of a British warrior. Quote, "They fight with swords and small shields. Their chariots are driven with remarkable skill." End quote. While Tacitus wrote with a Roman bias, his accounts provide valuable, albeit filtered, insights into the martial practices of Iron Age Britons, at least around the 1st century AD. Remains of late Iron Age 2-horse chariots have been found in East Yorkshire, and at least 2 accompanied burials of women, while a horde of showy chariot horse trappings have been discovered near Stanwick, Iron Age fortifications also in Yorkshire. These remains are too flimsy to have been used for chariot charges, as it would be described, but typify an individually heroic hit-and-run style of warfare proved to be no match for the Romans. In those cases, chariots were used to drive to the battlefield and act as transports for the infantry, who would then wait and pick up their charges after the battle. It Greek and Roman commentators provided the first written description of British war chariots. Chariots were the hallmark of Iron Age warfare in Britain, as noted by Julius Caesar in his account of his campaign from 55 to 54 BCE, one that we're going to go over in great detail later. He described Britain's use of chariots this way, quote, "They drive their chariots on all sides, hurling javelins, even as they leap down from their chariots and fight on foot." End quote. The chariot's dual role as weapon of war and symbol of status cannot be overstated. Archaeological finds such as the chariot burial at Wetwang in Yorkshire illustrate their importance. The Wetwang chariot, interred with a woman of high status, underscores the connection between chariots and elite identity. Sword and spears, however, were weapons that were for the use of ground troops, and they were more elaborate than what would be found with the Romans, as display seemed to have mattered almost as much as the utility in that case. Hilts often featured variations decorated with an anthropomorphic grip, which basically looked like human heads and bodies, sometimes very clearly so, in fact. Just as elaborate as the swords themselves are the scabbards which held them. At times, they would be leather, in other cases, bronze. Of course, leather versions would be harder to find and harder to evidence, but they would likely be owned, especially the bronze scabbards, by chiefs in the Iron Age or kings or whatever you want to describe them as. They themselves would have markings and artistic flourishes, which would obviously be about display over function. Another side of the making of swords was the marks that would be put on them by the makers of these swords to identify them as coming from a particular artist or blacksmith, depending on how you want to term that particular person. These markings were similar to what had been found in Europe, showing a pan-European trade of these items long before the Romans came to Britain. As we discussed, a lot of sword making was influenced by the culture near the central part of Europe that were developing Iron Age weapons and implements. In Orton Mere in Peterborough in 1983, there is an example of one of these swords. It was probably a ritual deposit, which of course is an offering to the gods or ancestors being placed in the water, similar to pre-Roman offerings that have been found in other parts of the Peterborough area. This would also be typical of lake and river deposits in Wales and other parts of Britain that we've mentioned many times now. Spears made up the other weapon of choice, and likely these were relatively cheaper to produce and therefore weapons that were used by groups who either did not have the ability to deck out their elites in swords, or possibly it was a regional preference, or it may have been weapons for people who could not afford swords, similar to how pikes were the weapons given to the lower class soldiers in the medieval and early modern period. And I would also add, didn't have the skill as, say, a proper archer would. Iron Age people used spears of different shapes and sizes. Most would have had speared heads made of iron, but sometimes they were sharp bone points that were used as well. Some looked narrow, similar to a Roman pilum, while others had broad heads that were much wider, looking a lot like an arrowhead, to use the description. Many spears were plain and undecorated, though there has been evidence of bronze being used in some of the decorative placements, and likely it was depending on culture and other reasons as to why they were decorated, i.e. the wealth of the local community and or possibly the peacefulness of the local community allowing them to do these things rather than mass production of weaponry needed by someone who's under threat constantly. Additionally, slings and stones were made as an assistant in projectiles along with arrows. There was evidence of use at various hill forts, most famously at the hill fort at Maiden Castle, which it is thought was a site of a major battle between the Romans and Celtic forces in the early part of the Roman invasion in the 1st century AD. What would an Iron Age warrior look like? While we can't get into massive detail, we can give you examples from Europeans who had introduction to them and on some of the archaeological finds that were made. Iron Age warriors typically wore tunics made from woven wool, often dyed using natural pigments derived from plants and minerals. These dyes would then be used to produce reds, blues, and yellow colors, which these bright colors were not just for aesthetic appeal, they also showcase the warrior's wealth and status. Obviously, the more expensive the dye, the more expensive it looks, the more elite it seems. Hair, of course, played a significant role in the projecting of images of power, especially when you have warriors who are not wearing helmets. Warriors often styled their hair in dramatic ways. The Greek writer Diodorus Siculus in the 1st century BCE described Celts this way, quote, "Their hair is blonde, but not naturally so. They bleach it. Some of them are clean-shaven, but others, especially those of high rank, shave their cheeks but leave their mustaches that cover the whole of their mouth." And this is where you get that classic image of Obelix in the Asterix comics, who has that massive mustache that covers his whole mouth. And that kind of image of the Celts as being in that kind of look and feel comes from these kind of descriptions. Body art, of course, is another fascinating aspect of Iron Age warrior culture. Julius Caesar himself mentioned the use of woad as body paint, although modern scholars have debated the accuracy of this claim. There is strong evidence, however, of the use of tattoos and painted designs in Iron Age societies. So it's not like it wasn't. It's just there's a debate about how much or in what way. And these likely had ritualistic and symbolic significance. This is something we'll probably go into in the next episode when we talk about religion and mythology and how it affects so much of Iron Age Britain at the time. Jewelry also was common amongst warriors. The introduction of the torque, the brass or bronze hoop that would go around the neck of someone. These ornamented neck rings were made from twisted metal. Sometimes they would be solid, but sometimes they would have twisted pieces that would make up it. And it was a status symbol that could also be considered to have magical or religious connotations and showed that the wearer was someone of importance. An elite warrior and or chieftain or king would wear a torque. It would be symbolic, similar to a crown, I guess, if you wanted to describe it as such. And in that way, it's a very elaborate display item to go along with all the other bits of presentation that are being made. So in the long run, when we're talking about warfare and how it was done in Britain, keep in mind that some of it was done in a display method. The show was as important as the actual battle. But it doesn't mean that there weren't battles. It doesn't mean that there were not fighting that was just as important. You have battles that are being done to try and take over territory, to take religious sites of worship, maybe to take cattle and resources away from people, to possibly punish people for doing these kind of things. There's so many different reasons for them that we can't even know necessarily, but we can make assumptions based on other cultures and societies where this very much does go on. Think of native cultures in the Americas where fighting over cattle and sheep and other resources were a very big thing. And especially once the advent of the horse in the area, it also became about capturing other tribes' horses to be used elsewhere. So all of these things are important, and it's seen in some respects as both important for economics, but also probably important in ritual ways that we don't fully understand or know, and something that we'll have to continue to look into. And like I said, we'll start to get into the religious and ritual aspects of all this in the next episode next month. Thank you all for listening or watching today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. It was a lot of fun. And I hope that you, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you'll reach out to me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com, or you can reach me at Blue Sky or Twitter or Instagram at Welsh History Pod, or on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And of course, as always, if you want to help the podcast out, consider donating to our Patreon at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you all once again. Have yourselves a tremendous day. We'll see you. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.